on to the dais. As the introduction and other details of Dr. Anthony J. Evensen has already been shared with you, so I won't stand between you and him. I'll be as brief as possible. Evensen, basically we call him Tony sir. Tony sir is known for his acumen in terms of research, in-depth research in Pampāmāhātmya and Pampāmāhātmya. So Hampi is major focus of his research area. So he will be presenting about Pampāmāhātmya in detail or in short as it is convenient. After his presentation, if time permits and if he allows, we will have a couple of questions at the end. So with this few words, I would like to invite Dr. Tony sir to make this presentation.
Thank you for the invite. Thank you for having me here. I must perhaps begin with a disclaimer that I was only given the invite this morning, so I had to pull together a presentation in a very short time. So if it's not very polished, please be forgiving for that. The basic idea was to simply share with you some of the work that we've been doing in translating the Pampāmāhātmya. How many people in the room have been to Hampi? Probably most people. One only? A few? Okay. So as you know, it's a place of historical significance, it's a place of religious significance, and it simply has a powerful presence. I think anybody who's been there, going back to 15th century Portuguese travelers, have been just wowed by Vijayanagara and the landscape. It's very magical, and it has a way of grabbing your soul, in a very powerful way. My first time to Hampi was exactly 20 years ago. I came in 2003, and I came on a pre-dissertation travel grant to sort of check things out on the ground and make contacts in India, and sort of decide on what my dissertation project would be. So here I am 20 years later, and we are very deep into this project, translating the Pampāmāhātmya, which is a major writing, as you'll see in a moment. You probably recognize this scene here. So the project is, we have some support from the Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts in New Delhi. You'll see, I'll introduce my project partners in a moment, and they have a working relationship with the IGNCA for other projects. So they have an established contractual relationship with them. We just finished a 3-year contract with them, and just today we got email notification for an extension for 3 more years. So that's kind of where it's at. So here's the team. Perhaps you know Dr. and Mrs. Vasundhara Filiozat and her husband Pierre Sylvain Filiozat. That's myself on the right. This is a picture of us in Hampi doing some exploration work on the ground. The goals for our project is, first thing is to locate as many manuscripts of the Pampāmāhātmya as we could find. And you'll see, I'll introduce you to what we did find. And then our goal is to produce a critical edition of the Sanskrit text, along with an English translation. The Pampāmāhātmya has never been translated to English. If I'm correct on my facts, I think Vijayanagara is unique in the amount of surface archaeology that's been conducted in the 80s and the 90s, thanks partly to Dr. M.S. Nagaraj Rao, who's now deceased. He ran Divanya Loka and so forth not so long ago, good man. I've met him in Chicago a few times, as well as here in Mysuru. And John Fritz, who just passed a few months ago, and George Mitchell. Those are some of the main brainchilds for the Vijayanagara Research Project team. And they've done amazing work on documenting all of the runes in Vijayanagara. However, the Pampāmāhātmya is an extremely important source for understanding the full history of Vijayanagara and pre-Vijayanagara history. And we don't have an English translation. So for the Indians, of course, you know Sanskrit, they have access to the text. However, as you'll learn in a moment, a number of chapters of the Pampāmāhātmya have never been published before. So when we published our critical edition, it will be the first time it appears in print. It only exists in manuscript form. Then we wish to actually study the text and understand the context and what does this text teach us about the history of the Hampi area, pre-Vijayanagar kings as well as Vijayanagara kings. And then ultimately, to the degree to which is possible, we would like to produce a map of Hampa kshetra from centuries ago. Kshetras change over time. I'm going to give you a couple indications of this in my presentation. So we did locate 5 sources of the Pampāmāhātmya. This is unlike some of the Mahapuranas where you have hundreds of manuscripts. The Pampāmāhātmya, we've been able to locate 5. 2 of these are palm leaf manuscripts that we obtained in London. One from the British Library and one from the Royal Asiatic Society. Okay. As you can perhaps see, the print is fairly small. It's clear though when you magnify it. It's Sanskrit language, but it's Kannada script. It's like a hybrid Kannada, a little bit of Telugu features to the script. We do believe that these are dated, of our 5 sources, these are probably our oldest sources, dating maybe 18th century. Okay. 2 other sources are paper manuscripts. On the left is right here in Mysore from the Oriental Research Institute. This is dated. It's a cursive Kannada Telugu hybrid form. It's in paper manuscript. And then we have a Devanagari paper manuscript. It's from Colin Mackenzie's travels. He visited Hampi. And we do believe that the Devanagari is more or less a copy of one of the palm leaves. They seem to be very close. When we see a Sanskrit error in the palm leaf, we often see that same error replicated in the Devanagari text. And finally, there is one printed edition of the Pampāmāhātmya, but it's not complete. None of these sources has all of the chapters. So that's one thing that will be novel about our edition. All the current Kannada versions that float around Hampi are all based on the 1933 book. They're Kannada translations of the 1933 book. So taken together, our critical edition, pulling together all of these various chapters, will be 173 adhyayas. 173 chapters. So again, some of which have never been seen before. And we've completed draft translations of 168 of these. So we're getting close to the closing stages of our project. So just to maybe walk you through, in case you're interested in this sort of historical work, I know some of you are students and thinking about how you may use your Sanskrit skills in the future. If you're interested in studying history, I'll just introduce you to a little bit of the process that we go through in working with this text. So I take the 5 sources. In this particular Adhyaya 14 of the Madhyama Bhaga, there's only 4 sources. The printed book does not have this chapter. So we basically transcribe and transliterate. For an English-speaking person like myself, it's a little faster to work with the Roman font. And I create parallel columns. I call this a synopsis. You can see all verses at the same time. And then we're going to look at variations. We're going to study these sources. And then the next step then is to decide on what is the correct reading, to sort of filter out the mistakes, to filter out the corruptions that can enter a text very easily, and kind of use one text as a check against the other text. And as you can see here that I'm working with, this is Adhyaya 16. This is a conversation with Bharadvaja and Vishnu Verdaha. And we have the first shloka here, and then we do the notation. We list the variant readings in various manuscripts. We choose what we think is the most reliable reading, and then we list the alternate readings. I don't know if you've ever seen a critical edition of the text before, but this is useful practice. And if you look very closely, you'll see something you recognize over there in the upper right-hand corner. I've worked with Dr. Suresh a number of years to sort of review my Sanskrit. It's always good to have extra eyes on this. So back in July of 2018, exactly 5 years ago, we walked through this text together. So it's been we'll get an acknowledgement on our publication. And then the final step, so the first step is get all the texts together, look at the various versions of every verse, pick what we believe is the most reliable text, note the variants, and then we produce the final notation, or the final version. So it's going to be a two-sided publication. Left page will be the Sanskrit text, right page will be the English translation. So Suresh asked me to really speak about what moves me with this project and what engages me with this project and why it's my passion. You know? I thought I would start with a quote from the prize-winning author Jugal Lahiri. Perhaps you've heard of her. They made movies from some of her books. And although she's speaking about a cousin language to Sanskrit, you probably know that Latin is a very, very close relative to Sanskrit. It has 8 cases. It has, I think, just 2 persons. It doesn't have a dual. And I think it has a neuter, it has 3 genders, I think, as well. But the quote says, it's a novel. It's called Unaccustomed Earth. And it stuck out for me because I thought it spoke to what I experienced when I'm working through trying to translate the shlokas of this text. So the quote is, and yet it was the aspect of her job, she's a scholar, this character in her novel, that required her to sit for hours alone at a desk that still fulfilled her more than anything. Since 8th grade, reading Latin had been an addiction. Every line a puzzle to coax into meaning. The knowledge she slowly accumulated, the ancient words and declensions and syntax that dwelling in her brain felt sacred, enabling her to bring a dead world to life. I really like this quote because it's what happens for me when I'm working through this text. I'm trying to struggle with what is the correct reading of the verse and what is the most faithful translation into English. And every shloka is a puzzle. You know, you have the pieces laid out there. You study your case endings. You know all your grammar, your syntax well. And then all of a sudden the meaning emerges. And you discover new things in the process. It's kind of it's an exciting process of discovery. So I like that quote, even though she speaks about Latin, the exact same thing is true of Sanskrit. So this is not purely sit behind a desk for long hours, although there is a discipline to this work like that, but also what's really energizing about this work is the opportunity to actually get on the ground and go searching through the hills in really these rather remote areas in Hampi, places that the tourists never go to. And Hampi is amazing. I mean, every time you turn a corner, you see a sculpture like in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it's marked with the sacred everywhere. Not just the big monumental temples like the Vitala Temple, or the Hazara Ramachandra Temple, or the Virupaksha Temple, but all these little minor shrines. They're on trees and they're on boulders. You know, it's almost too much to capture. So one thing we discovered is that the Pampāmāhātmya, I don't know how well you know the topography of kshetra, but currently right now there's a Melyavat mountain on top of which is the Raghunatha temple. It's sometimes called Melyavanta Raghunatha. But the truth is, at the time when the Pampāmāhātmya was written, the Melyavanta was closer, much closer to the Virupaksha temple. And that's surprising for people. When I was working with the Filiosas, they sort of refused to believe in it. Vasundhara especially, she sort of refused to believe it. She was so entrenched with this idea that, no, Melyavata's over here, Melyavata's over here. And so one time we took a trip together. This is the hill that's directly east of Hemakuta and directly west of Matanga. Again, I don't know how well you know the topography from your mind. But this is the hill that we know to be Melyavant. And there is a shrine on the southern slope. You can see the gate that enters it. And if you enter this gate, this is actually Dr. Filiosa here, husband and wife. And I took them into the cave. It's a cave shrine to Ganesha. And after we finished this trip, they said, yeah, they believe that this is the old This is like we call it Heriya Malyavanta. It's the old Malyavanta rather than the new Malyavanta. So that brings up many interesting questions. You know, how do mountains change? Who makes those decisions? Are they royal elites? Are these sectarian actors? You know that the Raghunatha temple was probably Sri Vaishnavas that were running that temple. They have some clout with the powers that be to be able to make that change from the old Malyavanta to the new Malyavanta. Brings up many interesting questions. Now, another thing that I love is that the text sometimes offers only the slightest clue to what a site may be. So this is a shloka from the Pampāmāhātmya, Adhyaya 41, and it speaks of the sacred site Hanumanishvara. And of course it's named after Hanuman, who worshipped here, trying to gain these characteristics. Now the Pampāmāhātmya, like many puranas, has very little historical dating information. It doesn't mention a single Vijayanagar king, even though we believe that major portions of it were written during the Vijayanagar period. But that's typical of Puranic texts. They seem to shy away from historical particulars. Okay? So I found it necessary to go to other texts that have information about Kshetra that are dated. So for example, Harihara's, he has a little-known Ragaleg called the Kshetra Ragaleg. And I've been working on this with Professor Taranath here at the Kuvenku Institute of Kannada Studies. He helped me with this somewhat. And it says that near to the place of Pampaa Virupaksha is Hanumanteshvara, which is unusually large. The word here you can see in Kali Kannada is Udutara, which is actually a Sanskrit word. Are loaned into. So Udu means wide, Tara means more, superior. So extra wide is not a bad translation for this. So I'm thinking, where could this Hanumanteshvara lingam be that's extra wide? So I got my hiking shoes on and I walked out to the shore of Tungabhadra, where I think these sites are referring to, this area near the Ghats on the Tungabhadra, north of the Virupaksha temple. And I discovered this site that, despite the amazing work that the Vijayanagara research project team did, this site is not documented. It's not on their maps. But as you can see, there was a bunch of structure here, right? You can kind of see an outline of the structure here. And the photo's not super clear, but there's some ruined pillars on the side. Okay? So if you look at a close-up of this, it opens up toward the river. Faces the river. This way was the entry. And it's an extra wide lingam. Now, it's hard to know for sure if this is a Hanumanteshvara, but it's a decent candidate. There's a possibility for that. So you get these little clues, and then you have to go to other texts, kind of gather more clues, and sort of piece together the puzzle. That's part of the excitement of it, but also quite challenging. So in the end, we also want to produce, as I mentioned in an earlier slide, we want to produce a map that gives us an idea of what Hampi looked like before today. So Google Maps is a great tool. I've been using Google Maps. So every time I get on the ground and I locate things, I try to put a little pin here to sort of record the location for that site. So we're working on that. That's still a work in progress. You know, getting up every morning, I tend to wake up pretty early, and I break open the Sanskrit first thing in the morning while I'm drinking my coffee, and you know, diving into the Sanskrit of an old text, to me, is a way of being very intimate with the place, even as far away as Chicago, where I do most of my work. You know, entering into the spirit of the text, you know. I think the text does embody something special about this place. And I refer to as kind of the soul of this place. And when you're there, it's undeniable. You definitely feel the presence of the place. So I think I used up my 20 minutes probably. So I thank you for your attention. I don't know if we have time for a question or two. I do my best. Do you understand the accent okay? Mostly? American accent is difficult. I would love to learn Kannada. That's my next goal, is to learn Kannada. Yes, you have a question?
Criteria to know the corrected text.
What text?
text, to know the correct text, what are the criteria?
Oh, the criteria. Well, first off, it has to make sense, grammatically. Sometimes there's simply scribal errors that they're mistakes. Just like any student makes spelling mistakes or grammar mistakes in a paper. I'm a high school teacher. I do research on the side. So you can eliminate those immediately, right? And then you have to look at the context. Does it fit the larger surrounding verses? What are they talking about? Like this morning, here, Filioza and I were working on Mahima Adhyaya 1, and there was a description of Hemakuta. It's talking about how the gods want to come to Hemakuta because there's so many, they only have one Kamadhenu in heaven, and Hemakuta has 1,000 Kamadhenus, So we had a choice on this one word, and the word that we chose better fit with the context of the Kamadhenu theme. Does that make sense? So you just have to make judgments like that. But if your judgment's not perfect, the alternate readings in the notes, so a later reader can make their own decision. It's like I can give examples from the Bible, because I know how the Bible works, but yeah, I won't go there. That's too much of a tangent. But all ancient texts are like that. You have to make informed decisions. There's not a perfect rule on how that's done. A lot of it's just sort of common sense. But that's the reason why you do the annotation. So other people have access to the alternate readings and make up their own decision. Even like sometimes the book is making a correction. The four manuscripts all agree, but the reading doesn't seem to make sense. But because they all agree, we're going to put it in the notes. Maybe somebody later will find some meaning there that we didn't find. Yes?
The thing is, India is being the land of most of the knowledge being transferred orally rather than in a written format.
Yeah.
During your research, did you find a way where you have any oral rendering editions available around India where this charita has been widely used?
Oral editions?
Oral editions, yes. How do you cope that into the physical editions?
The very fact that they're oral means they're not preserved, right? In the same way, so they get lost more easily. We do know from the work that was being done with John Frakes and George Mitchell and Asini Krishna Das and another man named Vishnu Tirtha, 3 of the 4 of those are deceased, that they had in their possession another manuscript that I have not been able to attain that was used by a Harikata. But according to the Brahmins in Hampi now, that the tradition is finished. Nobody does oral performance of the Pampāmāhātmya anymore. My personal theory is that the Purvabhaga, which is 98 Adhyayas, is used for oral performance. It's very narrative-based. There's a lot of stories. The Mahima Bhaga, we believe, is the oldest section. It's very dense in listing sites, a lot like the Sthala Purana. So the Purvabhaga perhaps had it not fully oral, but it was performed. There was a performance piece to it. I know of no purely oral tradition for the Pampāmāhātmya. I've come across nothing. If there were, it would probably be in the vernacular rather than the Sanskrit in this location. Yes?
Intention of doing all these things to discover the new information or old information from what exists on Vijayanagar. The intention of this.
I didn't quite get the question.
The
Old
intention
information, new information?
meaning that the intention of this work, complete total work.
Yeah.
What is the intention of this work?
It's to augment, really, to augment our understanding of the history of Hampi, the history of Pampāmāhātmya. It's one thing to look at monuments on the ground, but stone doesn't speak. You really need a text to kind of get a little deeper into what all of these things mean. Now, one thing I'm finding that's extremely interesting is that if you look at the Vijayanagar Research Project Team inventory and the sites that they find interesting, and you compare that to roughly 270 sites that are mentioned in the Pampāmāhātmya, they don't line up so well. I think modern archaeology has a preference for strong monumentality. They like the big temples, the highly ornate temples. But I think the religiosity of authors like those of the Pampāmāhātmya, they're also interested in these little small sites. They may be simple etching on a rock surface, but yet they have religious importance. So they're not necessarily the religious sites of powerful kings and elites, merchants that can afford these big temples. They're simpler sites, but yet they're powerfully meaningful at the same time. So I think the Pampāmāhātmya sort of offset that imbalance of a preference that leans toward the monumental. Books have been written on the Vitala temple. A book has been written on the Hazara Ramachandra temple. A book has not been written yet on all of the I call them open air shrines, like the rock surface of the lingam, or the Hanumanteshvara, I believe is the Hanumanteshvara lingam. Not a single word has been written about that site. So just to add to the knowledge. Yeah.
How long have you been working on this project, sir?
How long? That's a tough question. Filiosas, you may know Shilpa Pillai Iyengar. He was working with the Filiosas simply to do the data entry of the book, the 1933 book, into Word format. That was back in the 1990s. They kind of knew in the back of their mind that they wanted to eventually work on the Pampāmāhātmya. And then I wrote my dissertation in 2007 on Rama at Vijayanagar. And I was proposing that in order to understand the growth of the Rama temples at Vijayanagar, you actually have to look first at the Rameshwara temples, which I think precede the Rama temples in South India. And I wrote about a dozen pages on the Pampāmāhātmya based on what John Fritz and George Mitchell and those folks, some draft work that they had done. And then around 2014, just discussing Hampi stuff with the Filiosas, Pierre said, let's do a collaboration. So 2015 is when we sort of officially began the project. We're thinking, like, as I said, we're going to renew the contract for 3 more years. Hopefully it won't take that long, but we'll see.
But living in the USA, you could finish this project.
It's harder. It's definitely harder. I work, but because I'm a teacher, and we have an old joke in the U.S. that the best 3 reasons to teach are June, July, August. Now we have the summers off. It's beautiful. So I get to come to India. It's probably my 15th trip to India. So that's when we do FaceTime together. They have a home in Paris, and they have a home here in Mysuru. They spend about half the year each. I can only come for about 5 weeks. So I've done 2 sabbaticals. In 2005, I did a semester sabbatical here, more intensive. And in 2015, I came again for 5 months. And I may retire in a couple of years, so maybe I'll come more.
What's the most difficult thing you found during this project?
Good question. I think it's just the stick-to-itiveness of it, it's a lot of text. There has to be a discipline to return to it. And just stick with it, I like the glory part of it, I like the discovery, I like being on the ground. There's also sort of a tedious side to it, that sort of regimented daily side to it that is part of the reality of it.
How you came to know about this project?
That's a longer story too, I suppose. Not quite 173 chapters, but maybe I can give you a small version. I began my PhD in Buddhist studies, but I shifted over to Hindu studies at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And I was interested in Rama and the birth and the rise of the Rama cult, and that got me to Vijayanagar, and then that got me to Pampāmāhātmya. So just a chain reaction, one thing to another.
Passion, how you passion, your passion, how you
That
came
your passion into this subject.
I've always had an interest in religion as a powerful expression of what's deepest inside of us. And so I have a master's in Christian theology. I teach religious studies as well as mathematics. course on world religions, so I'm just fascinated by the various ways in which cultures express themselves through religious language. And how those overlap, compared to religion, how those overlap, how they're different from each other. I find all of that interesting.
To this project, related project, which are the related projects we can do, or we can use it like a related.
Well, that's what I'm glad you brought up that question, because I wanted to make that point. A scholar many years ago wrote an article that he published in a very prestigious journal called the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. And he was making the point that many Western scholars try to rush toward theorizing religion, when in fact he felt that we should spend more time on translating, because there's so many texts that have not been touched. The ORI, there's texts that are sitting on shelves that haven't been touched. So there's a huge need for translation to make these texts more widely acceptable. In Canada, I'm trying to learn Kannada. I've been working through the Pampāmāhātmya. As I said, in order to understand the Pampāmāhātmya, I've had to study all these other texts. Lakhananda Desha wrote Shiva Tattva Chintanami in the mid-15th century. And that has a lot of these, I think he's using Harihara's Pampāmāhātmya. He has the exact same listing. So that helps us get a little bit of a chronology for the sites that we encounter in the Pampāmāhātmya. So those are all side projects. Those have not been translated either. There's a real need for people who know Kannada and English. Maybe that'll be you.
I have a question which might not be related to the research, but
Yeah.
it's supposed to be from an archaeological point of view. The thing is, in
Hampi, when you visit, as a visitor, you can see most of the temples are destroyed, except Virupaksha which still stands. Probably that might be the oldest temple. So, does this Pampāmāhātmya itself have any reference to it about how why that stood up with the invasion rather than everything else?
Well, the Pampāmāhātmya, based on my last comment, that trying to find a chronology, I believe it's a complex text. I believe it's a later text. Again, if I go back to the Bible is 66 books written over 1,000 years. Pampāmāhātmya is not that complex, but I think there's 2 or 3 layers to it. So the oldest layer is certainly the Mahimabhaga. And our estimate is 14th, 15th century there. Maybe there's an older core to that. The Purvabhaga is probably, that could be post 1565 Talikote construction. In fact, one evidence in the text I find highly interesting that may point to this historical moment, and I think this is unlike Sthala Puranas anywhere else I've encountered, is that of the 98 Adhyayas in the Purvabhaga, I don't remember the exact number, but about 57 of those are describing the gateways of the kshetra. So there's an obsession with the boundaries, protecting the boundaries. To me, that could be a historical memory of invasion, I've never seen a text focus that much space, narrative space, on the gateways in all of the Samskrita Bharati I've ever encountered. So there's a few things like that, but the Virupaksha temple, of course, is the center of the kshetra, but there's other temples that you go to Hampi you hear nothing about, but they were important at the time of the text. The Rameshwara temple is mentioned by Harihara, it's mentioned in our text. There's an 1199 inscription that's in the Durga Devi temple right now that mentions Rameshwara temple. That text has been mistranslated by several people. But so we want to bring some of those things alive again because they've been lost across time. The Virupaksha temple has lasted amazingly long time. But many other temples have just faded. I think that's just the natural cycle of things. Things just sort of lose importance over time. But it gives no reason for that.
A quick question about translating.
About which?
About translating. Translation.
Yes.
So there are some words in Sanskrit like kind of difficult to put into the English language. For an example, nowadays I am doing one translation for my dissertation,
Yeah,
like Vajramani. Vajramani. That is kind of a diamond gem,
yeah,
but
hydromony,
yeah, but
diamond jewel.
yeah, diamond.
Or
Gem.
thunder jewel or something,
Yes.
yeah, diamond jewel.
But in that the contextual meaning is highly difficult to put into English words.
Yeah.
How do you overcome a challenge like that?
For words that have, you have to unpack, you have to tell a story to explain a word, we leave it untranslated. And we'll have a glossary.
Mhm,
glossary
okay,
again,
yeah.
So tapas, we tend to leave tapas
Yeah, yeah.
untranslated. I mean, that's my preference. Some people translate kshetra as like holy space. I prefer to keep it as kshetra. People
Yeah.
know kshetra. Anybody who knows, has a basic sort of education in Puranic literature, knows tirtha, knows kshetra, knows tapas. We leave those untranslated. Now, there's technical terms like flower names, you know, kalahara, and specific species.
Yes.
So the OSA is really good about matching those with the Latin names, the scientific identities.
Yeah.
His father, you know, was a medical doctor, and he was an expert at that sort of thing. So, and sometimes the other way to do it too is if it's we just put a footnote and we try to explain it in a footnote.
Yeah.
So those are all options to do that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. It's a good question. Okay, well, I thank you for your great, awesome questions. Good luck in your work, and I'm honored to be here.